People who don't want to have kids should not be forced into it. I stand by that. Money can't buy a baby boom. I was listening to Ashley Embers's newest video as of my recording this on Tuesday, May 20th at about 4 p.m. The one called "The Government Really Just Said Nobody Wants to Mother Anymore." Her points were more about motherhood specifically and all of that. Though I would argue that now it's different across the book. It's different between the two sexes for the experience. Though I would argue that there's a question of whether men want to father anymore or anything like that. Because when I heard about the $5,000 cash payout or whatever they call it for whatever they were going to call it, I was like, this is a terrible incentive. Not because I'm particularly against other people having children. I should probably make my stance clear. I have decided that I am not having kids, no matter how good or bad the economy is, no matter how the state of the world is. I've decided I do not want the responsibilities. I do not want the liabilities. So I have opted out of parenthood. That being said, I can recognize that it's for the greater good that we have a healthy birth rate. And as I may have said in previous videos, anyone who wants to have kids should not be impaired from doing so. While people who don't want to have kids, like me, shouldn't be forced into it and should be left alone. Like, honestly, I'm starting to think there should be no tax incentive of any kind whatsoever, and that people who want to figure it out and actually fulfill the role of being a parent should be just free to do so. Like, hey, we're not going to stop you, but we're also not going to help you either. Though, I think there's legitimate argument to be had that it's in the government's best interest to help raise children or provides social safety nets and all that. The key word here being safety net, not a default. Not something that I would particularly recommend defaulting to. But yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this recently. I've been having trouble organizing the thoughts. So bear with me if I am a little all over the place, but as I said, people who want to have kids should be free to do so. People who don't should not be forced into it because it would be detrimental to both parties involved. It would be detrimental to the children because they would have guardians who were disinterested at best or outright resentful at worst, which would lead to poorly raised children, which would perpetuate a cycle of neglect, abuse, and resentment if the whole cycle continued. Whereas if people who truly wanted to have kids, whether because they felt the need to be, whether it's because they are religious or they just want to feel the deeper sense of fulfillment in general, if someone wants to do that, they are probably going to do a better job just by way of going in, putting their best foot forward, and learning from their mistakes. Whereas someone who doesn't want to have kids, if they're forced into it, they are either going to not be as inclined to do anything more than the bare minimum. This is assuming they don't just find other ways out, which I would strongly recommend against because other ways out could involve prison time. Though I'm pretty sure that if CPS finds bad living conditions and such, they'd probably just take them away for you. They'd probably just take them away from you and then they'll have done the job for you. Again, I'm not recommending you go out of your way to get into trouble with CPS or the law. But what I'm trying to say is only interested parties should be involved in this because, yes, you can argue taking responsibility for your actions and all that. But at a certain point, you have to accept that some people are not cut out for this. Some people are better off not being parents because they would not want to do a good job or do anything in the first place. If you need an example for why the $5,000 payout is a terrible idea, clearly you haven't watched Futurama. TLDR, there's an episode where Bender becomes a foster parent because he wants to bring in more money. And he just keeps on adopting kids for the sake of bringing in more money, and then realizes he has to actually put in the work. He has to actually pay attention and actually consider the children's well being rather than just using them as a way to collect support checks from the government. Frankly, that is just a demonstration of how that's a terrible incentive. Personally, I think material support is the best way to go about this. I remember seeing a video of a divorced dad who decided to try replacing child support payments, with providing material goods to the ex-wife or the mother of the child so that he would know that not a dime of his money was going towards something that wasn't for the child. Personally, I think a good compromise would be reimbursements or half reimbursements instead on things that were needed for the child instead of just arbitrary child support payments. Like, think about it. Maybe if divorced parents paid 50-50 for a big purchase for the child or children, and then if or if receipts were provided and the total amount necessary was paid back to the mom who's the primary care provider, the primary guardian with majority or full custody if that's the case. I think that would make a lot more sense. But getting back to the whole idea that money can't buy a baby boom, yeah, money's definitely a part of it, like the economy and such. The reason that the silent generation is called that is because they were born during the Great Depression when birth rates declined because, well, the Great Depression, not exactly a whole lot of money going around. And then World War II, most of the men were off at war. And they came back in May and August, respectively, depending on which theater of the war they were operating in. That's why 1946 is the start of the baby boomers, because most, if not all of them, were conceived in. Most of the 1946 boomers would have been conceived in 1945. Of course, some of the very early ones, like January, February, March, would have been conceived in April, May, or June of 1945, like right before the end of World War II, or at least the European front for America. But I think you get the point. The silent Jenners are a lot fewer because there weren't as many of them born, because the Great Depression did play a role in the declining birth rate. Actually, let's look up what the birth rate was during that time. The reason I'm curious about that is because, despite all of this, my silent generation grandparents were born in the late 30s, early 40s. They're both part of large families. All right, populationreferencebureau.org Okay, this might be a little outdated because it says July 8th, 2009. Let's just roll with it for now. Average children per woman. Okay, 42, 43, 44, 45. Yeah, 45 was at the lowest, and then 46. That is when the spike began. See, that's why they say that the boomers start in 46 and then end in 64. Yeah, I think I've gone over this before. But as you can see here, before the Great Depression, 1927, 28, 29 saw the decline, and that kept on shrinking until the 30s. So it actually started to climb back up towards the end of the 30s and into the early 40s. But then World War II happened. Again, the reason I'm curious about the numbers compared to now is because my grandparents were one of 6 and 10, respectively. I mean, one of them was one of six, the other was one of four. Both of which are numbers that are way higher than the usual expectation of people having 2 or 3 kids these days. Like, I can observe it with what happened afterwards. So, my grandparents, those 2 grandparents, they had a total of 5 children, and then each of those 5 children, uh, one of them never had kids before he died. One of them probably won't at this point. And then my mother obviously had 3. One of her sisters had 1, and one of her brothers had another 3. So the number of grandchildren that they had just barely exceeded the number of children they had. The population pyramid continued to play out the way that it's traditionally does, where the younger generation comprises more people because mostly by virtue of the fact that the older generations, more of them have already died for whatever reason. Unfortunately, that's just what happens sometimes. Sometimes people die in their 30s or 40s. Other times, people make it to 100 years old. It's just an unfortunate fact of life. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about all this because it was spinning around in my head. To recap, people who don't want to have kids should not be forced into it. I stand by that. And I really hope that the declining birth rate is just a sign that people who don't want to have kids, who shouldn't be forced into it, they just aren't doing that, and it's for the better that disinterested parties are not involved in raising children because at best they'd be negligent, at worst they would be resentful and probably a little cruel. Not talking about anyone individually, specifically. I'm just saying that the odds of that are more likely to happen compared to, I don't know, a couple who gets excited about the fact that they are having a kid, who are willing to take on the responsibilities and liabilities. I think the economy is a small part of it because, as you saw, the Great Depression, there was a bit of a plummet, it, not a bit of a decline, but maybe my grandparents are anecdotal evidence because my, my great grandparents were Catholics who likely followed the no contraception teachings of the Catholic Church to a T, and that's why they ended up having 6 and 4 kids, respectively. So, yeah, on that note, I'm going to leave it here for the video because it's not just about the money. I mean, it's definitely good to be financially stable, but at a certain point, you have to accept that people who don't want to have kids shouldn't be forced into it. People who do should be free to do so. Give this video a like. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for daily videos, and I'll see you soon.